and in trying to introduce him. And what I don't like, particularly when people describe Dr. Sylvester, is merely from a museum perspective. They forget. I think by the time I came to UNAM, he was living as an important and brilliant historian. Dr. Shiweda, who was here, his PhD was supervised by him. And maybe we need to find a way to bring him back to the history department. It's a brilliant combination. We hope that we are able to do something significant. So see yourself as part of history.
Yeah, thank you, Papa. I think Papa has motivated you all to buy and read this book. But I'll say a little bit more about what is inside. But perhaps first of all, I should just say a bit about how I got to be here myself, as I was asked, and the journey we took to create this book. And I should say that it's not like we're standing here ready to introduce the book to you, but it's really a work of let me say, a family. It's a group work. If you look inside the book, you'll see the names of many people that contributed to this book. So we are two of them, but there are many others. Tate Shikonga, who is sitting here, was one of them. Tate Mbenzi is in the audience. He was one of them. There were many people who contributed. So let us not just say it is us, it is all of us who contributed. Myself, I came to Namibia in 1990, just after independence. I was working, or I was the chairperson of the Namibia Support Committee. We were supporting the liberation struggle in different ways, sending supplies to the camps and lobbying for independence. But I came permanently here in 1997, January 1997, when I became a history lecturer at UNAM. And we did many things there about trying to change a curriculum to bring Namibian history into the Namibian history department at the university, and also to introduce public history, to look at our... And part of that was in 2015, we managed to get some money from the Finnish embassy, and the curator of Nakambali Museum and a couple of others went to Finland. And we looked at the museums there that had Namibian collections. And one of the collections we saw was that of Nakambali himself, Martti Rautanen. And we produced a report and 25 recommendations, and one of them was that that collection should be known in Namibia. And this publication, really the core of it is showing those objects. But then there's much more than that, because there was a process of what is the meaning of these objects. In Finland, they were basically in cupboards, in storage. But by getting photographs of them, we don't have the objects, we had the photographs. And then going through a process of having a workshop where we talked with elders, with people from the community. Colleagues went out and talked in the villages as well. We showed the photographs. Also, we translated notes that were collected by Martti Rautanen. When he collected the objects, he asked people about them. So there was also his notes as well. And from that, we put information with the objects, and that's what brings the objects to life. So that is the core of this publication. It's not really people are calling it a catalogue, but it's not really a catalogue. It's like an encounter with these objects, a re-encounter. And to me, what was striking was when we showed these objects to people, sometimes the elders were coming with the names of the objects, but the younger generation were not knowing those words. It was even finding new words for objects that were no longer found in the community. Inside this publication, apart from the objects, we have a number of other sections. One of them is one of the genealogies, one of the accounts of the line of kings in the kingdom. And that was one that was recorded in 1943 by 3 elders then, so it's over 80 years ago. And people will look at that, and you'll also know from other sources, other accounts of the line of kings, the Amakroniwa. But this is one from 1943, so I think it's also interesting to see how the story was told by these three elders then, and to compare it perhaps with other accounts. Also, for me, what is very important in this publication is the section on Umpapa. Because for me as a historian working also with the Heritage Council, if you look at what is our heritage sites, our places of importance, you know, we have churches that were built in the German times, we have fortresses, but these graves go back, and this is just in the one kingdom that we looked at, these graves go back, and the oldest that we have identified is probably from the 17th century, 1650, maybe earlier even. And so these sites are really important heritage sites for Namibia. And we hope that in this by putting them in this publication, we're raising that issue. Because it's not just for Ndonga, for Ukwanyama, for other kingdoms, the graves of the kings, Yohamba, the grave of Yohamba in Ukwanyama. These are such important places, and we fear that they are being forgotten and neglected. So as we want this book to also raise that issue, and to say we should be documenting these sites and protecting them and preserving them as important places of identity. As I say, the core of this publication is the 126 objects that Marty Rautanen collected but ended up in the National Museum in Finland. So we worked with them to get photographs of the objects. And Rautanen was in the north from 1873 for 46 years. So these objects were collected during that period, most of them at the end of the 19th century. And I think for me, the other thing that's important, and why I think it's important that many of these objects should come back to Namibia and to the communities that they came from, is because they tell us so much about early Namibian history. Looking at these objects, to me, they are a kind of archive. And through them, you can read the history of trade and relationships between communities in Namibia, not just the colonial history. And I think sometimes we have emphasized so much the colonial history of Namibia, but we forget the importance of the African history that was here before colonialism, where people were trading and having conflict, having relationships outside of that paradigm. And I think when you look at these objects, you see the beauty of craft trades in those early years. And you see trade between communities. You see the way in which copper was mined by San communities around Otavi and Chumeb, brought to the Ndonga, who were like the specialists in working with copper, traded with the Kwanyama, who were specialists in working with iron from the iron mines around Kasinga. And these whole narratives, these whole stories of trade and relationships between communities, I think they've been neglected in the way we have been writing history. And I think one thing that this book has shown, and in terms of already people, when they look at it, the objects like photographs, they provoke memories, they provoke more stories. This is not a complete account, but by reading this and sharing it with people, I think we'll find out more. We'll learn more about the past. And finally, because I want to leave space for us to have discussion and comment, it's very important. I just want to talk about, okay, I'll apologize, but I'll pronounce Emanya Loshilongo Shandonga. And this is a piece of one of the sacred stones of Ndonga. And I think that is perhaps one of the most important object that is in here. And I think that is the object that is most important to be returned to Namibia. We know that the Finns already returned sacred stones to Okwanyama and Ombalantu. This was a piece of stone that was taken, and we have the account from people's diaries of how it was taken illicitly from the grave where it was kept, and then taken out. Actually, they took two pieces of stone. They were stopped, and one piece was taken from them. They gave up one piece, but they kept one piece. And we knew this narrative, but we didn't know where it was. When we were in Zurich, we were asking, actually, when we saw this collection, is this piece of stone here? It was only when we went to Finland, and after we left, we never saw it then either, but we got photographs of the objects that they had. And when we looked through, we saw this piece of stone. And then we asked the museum, can you translate the information you have about it? And that's when we realized that this was a piece of stone that had been taken from Ndonga. And it was part of a sacred stone that is believed to have come maybe with Mbwenge from the side of the Kavango River, and had a very important sacred role in the kingdom. So I think, in conclusion, what I like to say is, I think doing this research and finding out these objects that are held, let me say, almost in exile outside the country, and making people aware, and this is what this publication does, it makes people aware of what is there, and I think it's having a very important cultural impact. The return of some of these objects reinvigorates a sense of cultural identity and knowledge about traditions that maybe have faded. And so I think there's a lot of conversation at the moment with German museums about the return of objects. And I think sometimes it's not just, but it is within the important framework of the genocide. But other objects that were taken, like this piece of the sacred stone, but are part of people's cultural identity, part of their history, part of their traditions. I think that those objects being returned is also important. And I hope that this publication helps take that process forward and also helps us recognize, document, and preserve the graves and the cultural artifacts in our communities, and helps us create local museums where these objects can also be seen by younger generation. Thank you.
Yeah, manga tulipe manya. Where we are at the stone. Oshi mashasi mana. Emanya Joshirong.
Firstly, on leadership, I think we don't need to look outside for inspiration, but inside Namibia. And I think the point I would like to make is that if you look at the elders who led the independence struggle, who brought independence, when they started the struggle, they were in their 20s. And their action was to stand up and stand up against injustice as young people. And I think that's the lesson, that actually young people need to stand up and take the lead by standing up against injustice and corruption and wrongs in society. I would just like to say, when you mentioned China, what disturbs me in Namibia today, in a country which has been battered by racism and the impact of racism in its history, is now we're seeing racism in a new form in Namibia, and that is anti-Chinese racism. And I think it's important for young people to also stand up against racism if it takes new forms, against tribalism, which can also destroy a nation. And if young people don't take a stand against these things, Namibia can also be destroyed again and be fragmented. On the point of the graves, I think again there is action that people can take. We shouldn't just sit and say, isn't it a pity? My colleague here from National Heritage Council can confirm that actually any of you can approach a National Heritage Council and nominate and say this is a place of importance. It should be recognized by the National Heritage Council as a heritage site of importance and get that protection. So we can walk out today and do something about this. And that's what I'd say. Young people can make a difference, so why not?